We're here with Kristian Sandstrom, a PhD and a researcher in disruptive technologies and a researcher with the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. So Kristian, it's wonderful to have you here, and you've done a lot of really interesting work sort of putting disruptive technology both in theory, in a really interesting theoretical framework, but also applying it to lots of really empirical work. And I was wondering if you could explain in so many words, what is your theory of disruptive technologies?
The topic of disruptive technologies originally comes from business administration, where it was developed in order to explain why established firms sometimes struggle when their industry goes through technological change. And the logic of the argument is that the disruptive technology, which eventually then comes to displace a former technology. Now, I did a couple of such studies during my PhD. I look at the camera industry and the shift to digital photography, for instance. The disruptive technology usually starts off in a small fringe market with a worse performance than the dominant technology. Now, in the case with digital photography, digital imaging initially then had a poor image quality and was bulky and heavy and looked like a toy almost, and therefore it prospered initially in small segments of the market, studio photography, etc. And as it prospers in a very small fringe market, it becomes difficult for a large established firm like Eastman Kodak to bother about it initially, because a big company can only prioritize a big market, a big mass market that it can analyze, that it can understand and look at the segments. So they fail, the established firms fail to prioritize the disruptive technology at an early point. And as a consequence, when the performance of it increases over time, in terms of, in this case, image quality, those companies will be displaced because they did not prioritize the small market initially. So that is more or less the framework, the theory of disruptive innovation.
One of the areas that we're really interested in at the Startup Cities Institute is the extent to which things like law and governance, or a new model of municipal governance, or these kinds of things that sort of are social or political, to the extent these things can be viewed as technologies. Maybe social technologies might be an apt word. I'm wondering, do you see any way that these kinds of things could fit into your framework of disruptive technology?
I think you can clearly learn from the frameworks, the theories about how firms are being displaced by disruptive innovation. I think the mechanisms are, in surprisingly many regards, are quite similar. So if we take the framework of disruptive innovation, where a technology with an initially odd performance, like digital photography, once again, very good example. It's a worse performance along some dimensions, but it creates value in new ways, and it's hard for you to grasp it initially, and it will prosper in a small fringe market. If you think about free cities, you take Hong Kong, for instance, it was initially something small that economists did not bother about to start with, or they even criticized it in the 1960s. Economists said, you have an excess supply of entrepreneurship in Hong Kong. And then gradually you see that this actually works in this small fringe area. And it starts to spread to more of the mainstream. And that is what has happened in China and Southeast Asia, more or less over the last 30, 40 years, that it spreads from being initially something very small, very odd, that is disregarded, and then eventually gaining momentum and becoming the norm.
Now, in the framework that you outlined, you mentioned that established firms tend to be sort of blinded by the markets that they typically work in. Those markets are legible to them, they understand them, they have a history in them, that they don't even see these things coming. I guess in our political analogy, this would be currently existing nation states or currently existing nations. Do you see, what are the effects of something like, say, a startup city, if it follows the trajectory that you're describing? What do you see happening from the standpoint of it being a disruptive technology?
Well, I think you're right, first of all, in your way of describing it, that in the same way as a big firm prioritizes a big market, a big government or a big state will focus on its big budgets for development, for aid or military expenses, and they overlook what in the future comes to be proven to be what was the most important thing. The effect of all this is that development will happen in places where we don't think it is going to happen. And I think that is very much the story of global development over the last 40 years. You go back to 1980, when Asia is still, in fact, the poorest continent on Earth. Most people, most economists thought that that would prevail, that pattern, and that Africa would be the next continent to grow. Well, if you look at it ever since, you see that Asia has been growing at very high rates over those years. So the consequence is that development as we know it will happen in places we don't think it will happen.
One thing that you just mentioned is that economists may not be able to see this coming, right? So does this mean there's something inherently unpredictable about technological change? Or do you think with enough data or enough analysis you could predict this and that firms just aren't looking at the right data? Or do you think there's something that, say, the complexity is so great, or there's so many variables and they're recursive and we can't figure out which affects each other? Is it so complex that we're just never going to be able to predict things like where the next big Kodak failure is going to happen with digital imaging?
It's a good question, and while it's difficult to assess the future, and it will always be, and it is uncertain, not the least because the future is something we create. It isn't just something that happens, it's something we create, we influence it. But as a matter of fact, if you take a closer look at the decline of Eastman Kodak, Polaroid, other firms, they were at an early point capable of assessing what the future would be like. In the early 1990s, Kodak made predictions about when will digital photography displace photochemical film. And their predictions said it would happen around 2003, 2004. And in retrospective, they were right. So the problem is something else. The problem is often not to recognize it, but it is to take action. So if you're the CEO of Kodak, you sit there and you have this prediction, you buy into it. What do you do on Monday? That's the difficult question.
So bringing us back to our political analogy, in theory then, there are things that currently existing nations may see or predict that at the end of the day they still won't act on. are there things that could be done in the short term by nations to say hamper development, or to take advantage of the trends that maybe they already see to actually benefit and work with the way that technology is changing?
I think one must learn from history and take a look at what has happened in Southeast Asia over the last 30, 40 years, because that is completely different to what people expected would happen. And making a similar analysis today would imply that you have to reassess a lot of development work. So if you look at the policies of the Western world directed towards Africa since the 1980s, they are more or less the same now as they were back in those years. And they have embarked on the same trajectory, trying to make a faster horse, if you so like. And that money is misallocated. It is spent in the wrong way, but you continue along a predefined trajectory because that's what you've always done. It's what economic historians call path dependence. You move on along the same way you have in the past. So I think that is one important implication.
Would you say it's safe to say that the future of, say, innovations in law and governance or disruptive technologies in law and governance will be in the form of something like startup cities, or in the form of something that is catering to, say, niche markets, niche political markets, is sort of resoundingly ignored, starts small and then grows over time to envelop a lot more of the market for governance? What do you think about that? Am I seeing the future clearly, or no?
I think it will happen in small countries. Because going back to this analogy of a political system with its market, you can regard the market as voters here. A political system that is large is also more conservative. If you look at the reforms enacted in many of the Eastern European countries after the Berlin Wall fell, you see this very clearly, how they could enact rapid reform, create new institutions, privatize areas which were beyond imagination that they could be privatized in the Western world. And then gradually this starts to spread. It is easier, I think, to establish a consensus in a smaller country around a particular new policy. It is easier to experiment with new policies in a smaller country. It's less rigid, it's easier to obtain an agreement. So look at the smaller countries, look at what institutional change is happening there, or cities for that matter, and some of those small mutations there, zoom in and you have the future somewhere around there.
Now, one thing that's really stuck out to me is you seem to use the language of evolution a lot, and you know, you mentioned a mutation and that people will adapt to it, and this is very kind of biological in a certain sense. A lot of the people around startup cities are people interested in evolutionary politics, evolutionary governance, evolutionary economics. Did you see technology as an evolutionary system?
In many ways. To think about it as an ecosystem makes a lot of sense, that you cannot only analyze the technology in isolation, because the surrounding context, complements, markets, institutions for that matter, all of it you need to look at to understand the emergence of it and the pattern of displacement. Now, for instance, if you look at digital photography once again, when people in the 1990s tried to grasp, what will the digital camera look like, they put it in the analog world. of an analog TV, of a, film as a complement to it, etc. But what you can see is that digital photography really took off when the surrounding ecosystem also became digital, which is by the early 2000s that personal computers have become good enough to store many images. You get an internet connection that is good enough to share, and you get the mobile phones, etc. Then you get a quick emergence of it. So it's really an ecosystem that you need to think about when analyzing how technologies compete.
It seems like part of that ecosystem would be social technologies, things like law and governance structures. Do you see the, say, prevailing law and governance regimes or regulatory regimes or subsidy regimes or what have you as part of an ecosystem with physical technologies like digital imaging? And if so, do you imagine that the evolution of those areas would have significant impact in the evolution of physical technologies?
So my view of existing research on this topic is that it has only recently, in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, started to study the interplay between institutions and technology. And I believe there's a lot to be done there. Some of the studies I've conducted, I see that the role of institutions and the interplay is very important. And it goes both ways, really. You see how countries which have certain institutions are more capable of driving disruptive change. It is striking with the shift to digital photography how Japanese firms are much better off than American or European, for that matter, for some reason. So it's institution specific in many regards. Another study I conducted was about the shift from mechanical to electronic calculators back in the 1970s. And it's the same all over, that American, European manufacturers of mechanical calculators are displaced by Japanese companies who pioneer electronic calculators. So in that regard, institutions shape how firms are capable of responding. But it goes the other way around also, that some firms are capable of transforming institutions. If you look at the gambling monopolies in many Western countries, like Sweden, for instance, you see how technology has enabled firms to supply online gambling services, which means that the government monopoly it only exists on a sheet of paper after a while. In reality, it is gone because others can supply this service from elsewhere.
Now, taking what you've just said, I wonder if you would be willing to be a little bit normative in the sense that how important do you think that process is of, say, an internet technology sort of overthrowing the currently existing on-paper monopoly of gambling establishments, or you have the rise of some competing firms somewhere else which, say, overthrows a highly subsidized monopoly firm in some other country. Do you think that this process of institutional competition is important for allowing technological innovation in the long run and for disruptive technologies to take off?
Yes. And if you look at it historically, so the gambling monopoly is one more recent example. Telecommunications is a very interesting example. If you go back to before it was deregulated, you had one supplier, and you weren't, even in Sweden, you weren't allowed to choose which color your phone should have. Financial markets are perhaps even more important, and how as money became electronic, they did not any longer know national borders. So how can you uphold a certain financial regime based upon a fixed exchange rate, as many countries had in the 1980s, when capital no longer know borders? They cross borders in any way they wish, back and forth. It becomes more or less impossible to uphold regulation. So those processes of how technology transform politics and how institutions change, I believe they are understudied and they are under-ignored. We tend to think that either politicians or ideology are the forces that shape policy in the long term. But I think technology shapes policy perhaps even more.
Thank you, Kristian.
Thank you, Zach. Great to be here.